Good evening. You may have thought you've heard it all about the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, but tonight we'll be showing you evidence never televised before that may make you think twice about what you thought you knew. You'll hear from a well-respected detective who resigned from the case after 18 months because he says those in charge weren't listening to him. Tonight we are, as he takes us back to the crime scene, the house in Boulder, Colorado, where 6-year-old JonBenét was murdered Christmas night, 1996. Or so he thought. 3.5 months after JonBenét's murder, Smit was called back into action by the Boulder County District Attorney's Office.
I thought it was going to be a slam dunk, Katie. I thought this was going to be an easy case.
Another day brings more tidbits of information.
After all, he followed the early media coverage just like everyone else. He'd heard that the Ramseys were uncooperative with the police, that there were rumors of sexual abuse, that the ransom note was a fake, that there were no signs of forced entry, and he knew that in the murder of a child, the parents are always prime suspects. According to the Justice Department, only 1 in 12 child murders is committed by a stranger. Lou Smit showed me around the Ramseys' former home in Boulder, now owned by friends who want this story told. Smit says once on the case, he quickly discovered he couldn't believe everything he had heard or seen, like the footage that seemed to show no evidence of an intruder the night of the murder.
I even thought to myself, how could anyone get into the house without leaving some type of a footprint in the snow?
But then he saw the actual crime scene photographs taken the morning after the murder.
And then once we got the photographs, then you could see that there was no snow around the various doors and entry doors of the house.
Or the sidewalks.
Or on the sidewalks either. That's correct.
So the whole idea that no footprints meant no intruder to you was not necessarily true?
No, not once we seen the photos.
But another crime scene photo had already caught his attention.
The very first photograph that I seen of that basement window, the window was wide open. And I said, wait a minute, take a look at that. That was one of the light bulbs that went off and one of the red flags that I seen.
Some thought the open window was irrelevant because no one could get through it. Or could they? Even Smit, who's 66 and 5'9", could pull it off.
Yes, I've been in there several times myself, and even a large person can get in there.
Why don't you show me how you believe it happened?
You notice, Katie, that this is an area that's real hidden from view. There's fences all around, and this is a perfect place to go in because nobody can see you.
This case was riddled with inconsistencies from the start that pointed directly at the Ramsey family members. If these signs had been noticed and recognized earlier, the case could have been closed long ago. One of the most glaring red flags emerged from a neighbor's account of hearing a child scream in the dead of night, a sound that shattered the quiet, but somehow went unnoticed by those inside the house. Melody Stanton, who lived across the street, reported waking abruptly to what she described as a fairly shocking child's cry sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., a piercing noise carried through the cold December air. This wasn't just a faint whimper, it was the kind of scream that jolts you from sleep, suggesting a moment of terror or violence. Yet, John and Patsy Ramsey insisted they heard nothing from their bedroom upstairs, claiming a peaceful night undisturbed by any unusual sounds. How could parents, presumably attuned to their children's cries, sleep through such a disturbance while a neighbor, separated by a street and walls, picked it up clearly? This discrepancy alone raised eyebrows among early investigators, hinting at a possible cover-up or selective hearing that didn't align with the layout of the sprawling home. The basement, where JonBenét was later found, was far removed from the parents' quarters, but tests showed that sounds from down there could sometimes carry upstairs. Why, then, no reaction from the Ramseys? If an intruder was truly at work, wouldn't that generate enough noise to alert anyone in the house, especially vigilant parents on high alert after a family holiday? The neighbor's testimony, initially downplayed, could have prompted immediate scrutiny of the family's statements, forcing a deeper probe into whether they were minimizing or fabricating their obliviousness to buy time or deflect suspicion. Compounding this auditory puzzle was the bizarre ransom note discovered that morning, a document so unusual it screamed staging more than genuine kidnapping. Patsy claimed she found the 2.5-page handwritten letter on the kitchen staircase, demanding exactly $118,000, a figure that matched John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus to the dollar, an oddly specific amount for supposed strangers. Real kidnappers typically demand round, exorbitant sums to maximize profit, not a modest payout tied to insider knowledge of the family's finances. Why would an outsider know about that bonus, let alone peg the ransom to it, unless they had intimate access to household details? The note's language was theatrical and rambling, filled with movie-like phrases such as warnings from a foreign faction and dramatic threats of execution if instructions weren't followed. It read like a scripted ploy rather than the terse, business-like demands seen in actual abductions, complete with unnecessary flourishes that suggested someone trying too hard to sound menacing. Investigators noted the paper and pen used came from inside the home, and a practice draft was even found in a notepad nearby. How convenient for an intruder to linger, composing multiple versions without fear of detection. If this was a real kidnapping plot, why risk spending extra time crafting such an elaborate note when a quick grab and go would suffice? This anomaly could have been a game changer if pursued aggressively from day one. Handwriting experts later debated similarities to Patsy's style, and the note's placement on the stairs, a path the family used daily, felt too contrived, as if designed to be found immediately. Instead of treating it as ironclad evidence of an external threat, early responders might have questioned why the kidnappers would leave such a traceable artifact, potentially unraveling the narrative of intruder and shifting focus inward much sooner. The crime scene itself bore hallmarks of manipulation, with elements that didn't add up to a straightforward abduction gone wrong. JonBenét was discovered in the basement by John himself hours after the initial 911 call, wrapped in a white blanket with duct tape over the mouth. Yet the ransom note upstairs promised a safe return for payment. Why they finished this too soon before getting any ransom? This contradiction pointed to a hasty cover story, where a supposed kidnapping masked an internal tragedy. The ligatures around the wrists were loosely tied, more symbolic than functional, and there were no clear signs of a fierce struggle upstairs or forced entry that would indicate a botched invasion. Cobwebs on the basement window grate remained undisturbed, and foliage outside showed no trampling, belying claims of an outsider slipping in and out undetected. If an intruder had subdued a lively 6-year-old, carried her downstairs, and inflicted fatal injuries, wouldn't there be more disarray, more evidence of resistance like overturned furniture or scattered debris? The staging extended to the device fashioned from household items, a device that seemed perfect for diverting attention from accidental harm. Early police arrivals noted the scene felt too composed, with the note strategically placed and JonBenét hidden in a remote room, as if someone familiar with the house wanted to delay discovery while crafting a kidnapping facade. Why move JonBenét to the wine cellar all if the intent was ransom, unless the perpetrator needed time to regroup and align stories? These inconsistencies, if dissected promptly, might have exposed the ruse before friends and family contaminated the area, allowing for uncontaminated forensics that could pinpoint the truth. Further eroding the intruder narrative was the glaring absence of solid evidence for any external perpetrator, despite years of speculation. Police found no fingerprints, footprints, or tool marks suggesting forced entry. Doors were locked, windows intact except for one with a questionable break that predated the incident. Lou Smit's theory of an intruder entering via the basement grate hinged on disputed marks, like a scuff on the wall and a suitcase below the window. But these ignored the undisturbed dust and spiderwebs that would have been disrupted by anyone climbing through. How could a stranger navigate the labyrinthine home in the dark, commit the act, and escape without leaving a trail, especially in a neighborhood with recent burglaries, but no similar violent intrusions? The DNA samples touted as proof of an unknown male were later revealed as composite traces from at least 2 individuals, possibly transferred via manufacturing or handling. If this genetic material was the smoking gun for an outsider, why hasn't it matched anyone in decades of testing, and why overlook that it coexisted with familial traces? Smit's demonstrations, while compelling in isolation, failed to account for real-time conditions like frost outside, or the improbability of hauling a small people through tight spaces without noise or residue. The neighborhood's sex offenders were investigated, but none linked concretely, leaving the intruder idea as a convenient distraction from the family's inconsistencies. Had authorities zeroed in on these voids early, questioning the lack of snow prints or forced access, they might have dismantled the external threat myth before it took root, redirecting resources to the obvious internal anomalies. Even the timeline of events that morning amplified suspicions, with the 911 coming at 5:52 a.m. after Patsy allegedly found the note, yet no immediate search of the entire house ensued. Officers arrived quickly but allowed friends to enter, muddying potential evidence, while the Ramseys' behaviors, like John's later discovery of JonBenét, seemed scripted to some observers. Why wait hours to thoroughly check the basement if a child was missing, especially with a ransom demand implying she was off-site? The note's instruction not to call police was ignored, yet no consequences followed, further undermining its authenticity. These overlooked details, from the scream's selective audibility to the note's insider quirks, painted a picture of orchestration, rather than chaos, one that could have been clarified with prompt, unbiased scrutiny. The absence of intruder footprints in the frost-covered paths outside only reinforced this, as did the pristine leaf debris around potential entry points. If an outsider had truly infiltrated, wouldn't there be at least one misplaced item or foreign fiber tying to a suspect? Instead, everything circled back to the home's occupants. John's involvement at the scene went far beyond what any parent might do in a moment of panic, raising questions about whether his actions were impulsive or calculated to disrupt potential evidence. Critics have long pointed to this as excessive intervention, especially since John, a successful businessman with a composed demeanor, might have been expected to defer to law enforcement protocols. Yet, there was no immediate reprimand or effort to stop him from those on site. Detective Arndt, who was present, later recounted feeling overwhelmed as the only officer managing the scene for hours, but her decision to enlist John in the search itself opened the door to this mishandling. If John's actions were truly driven by grief, why did he not pause at the threshold, alerting authorities to photograph and document before any movement? This level of involvement echoes patterns in other cases where family members inadvertently or intentionally alter scenes. But here it's seen unchecked, fueling speculation about underlying dynamics. Perhaps his assertiveness stemmed from a subconscious need to control the narrative, or worse, to obscure details that might implicate those close to the situation. Regardless, his hands-on approach erased critical clues, like the exact positioning of the device around her neck, or undisturbed debris around her, which could have clarified the sequence of events. Turning to the police's blunders, they were glaring and fundamental, starting with Officer Rick French's cursory inspection of the basement early that morning. Arriving shortly after the 911 call, French scanned the lower level for signs of an exit route used by a supposed kidnapper. He paused at a door secured by a wooden latch from the inside but chose not to open it, reasoning that no intruder could have exited, and then latched it from within. This basic oversight meant JonBenét remained undiscovered for hours, allowing time for potential evidence degradation. How could an officer to methodically clear a premises in a missing child case walk away from a locked door without forcing entry or calling for backup? French's decision exemplified a core failure, assuming the scenario was purely a kidnapping without considering internal foul play, which led to incomplete searches and missed opportunities. Had he opened that door, the entire investigation might have pivoted immediately, with the scene preserved before John's later intervention. Beyond French's error, the broader handling by Boulder police revealed a cascade of elementary mistakes that any seasoned department would avoid. Upon arrival, officers conducted only a superficial sweep of the house, finding no obvious forced entry, but failing to seal off the entire property. They cordoned just JonBenét's bedroom, treating the rest as non-critical, which permitted friends, victim advocates, and the family's minister to enter freely. These visitors, in their well-intentioned support, picked up items, cleaned kitchen surfaces, and moved about, potentially wiping away fingerprints, hair samples, or trace evidence that could have pinpointed timelines or intruders. Why didn't officers establish a perimeter tape around the whole home right away, logging entries and exits to maintain chain of custody? This lax protocol turned a controlled environment into a social gathering, diluting the integrity of physical clues like the ransom note on the staircase or the bowl of pineapple on the table, which bore Patsy's fingerprints and linked to undigested fruit in JonBenét's system. Arndt's solo oversight for much of the morning amplified these issues, with no reinforcements until later. She couldn't monitor every corner, leading to unchecked movements. Her directive for John to search the house, a move that handed control to a potential witness, stands as a textbook violation of scene preservation. In standard procedure, civilians aren't tasked with such roles precisely to prevent tampering, yet here it happened without hesitation. This not only enabled John's excessive handling but also delayed professional forensics, as the team arrived to a compromised site. Questions up high: was this inexperience, with Boulder lacking prior expertise, or something more deliberate? The department's failure to involve FBI specialists immediately, despite the apparent kidnapping angle, further eroded chances for pristine analysis, as federal protocols emphasize rapid lockdown. John's unchecked actions intertwined with these police lapses in ways that invite deeper scrutiny. He arranged ransom payment logistics while officers milled about, yet no one curtailed his mobility or questioned his composure. When he finally located JonBenét and disrupted her position, Arndt didn't intervene forcefully, allowing the relocation that forensic experts later decried as catastrophic. This lack of real push against his over-involvement contrasts sharply with how authorities typically handle grieving families, keeping them isolated to avoid contamination. Could this leniency stem from an unspoken understanding, perhaps influenced by John's status as a prominent executive with local ties? Speculation bounds that a tacit agreement existed between him and key figures on scene like Arndt or even higher-ups, to afford leeway that skewed the probe. After all, basic errors, ignoring a latch door, permitting crowds, enlisting a father in searches, aren't just oversights, they're deviations from protocol that benefited a narrative of confusion over clarity. Such a pact, if real, might explain why evidence sharing with the Ramseys occurred prematurely, or why formal interviews dragged on for months without pressure. French's hesitation at the door, for instance, could reflect subconscious deference, avoiding discoveries that might implicate insiders. John's bold moves, unhindered, suggest he operated with implied permission, turning potential red flags into blurred lines. Of course, this remains mere conjecture, pieced from procedural gaps and behavioral anomalies, without concrete proof of collusion. Yet, the pattern persists. Police bungled fundamentals like securing perimeters or documenting untouched areas, while John's interventions filled those voids, effectively muddying waters that might have revealed truth sooner. And problems like these have partly obscured the case's contradictions and made them difficult to see early on. This case could have been viewed more clearly and examined more thoroughly, and in many ways, it should have been solved in just one day. One of the most straightforward paths to resolution lay in deploying tracking dogs right from the outset, a tool that law enforcement has relied on for decades in missing persons and abduction scenarios. These canines, trained to follow human scents, could have immediately confirmed whether JonBenét had ever left the premises, or if her trail ended abruptly within the walls of the home. In the hours following the 911 call, as officers arrived and began their initial assessment, the absence of any external footprints or signs of forced entry already hinted at an internal anomaly, but dogs would have provided irrefutable olfactory evidence. Bloodhounds, in particular, are renowned for their ability to pick up scents even after hours or days, distinguishing between fresh trails and older ones, and in this instance, they might have led straight to the basement, exposing the truth before the scene devolved into chaos. The Boulder police had access to such resources. Reports from the time indicate that Deputy Scott Williams, a K-9 officer from the Boulder County Sheriff's Department, was placed on standby early on, yet no deployment followed. This hesitation stemmed from internal debates over the type of dog, whether to use ground scent trackers like German Shepherds or air scent specialists like bloodhounds, mirroring disputes seen in other high-profile cases where bureaucratic indecision delayed critical actions. Imagine the scenario unfolding differently shortly after Patsy's call reporting a kidnapping. A bloodhound arrives, its handler allowing it to sniff items like JonBenét's clothing or bedding for a baseline scent. The dog, unburdened by human assumptions about ransom notes or foreign factions, follows the trail methodically through the house, ignoring distractions and zeroing in on the strongest path downward. Within minutes, it alerts at the basement door, the very one Officer Rick French had glanced at but left unopened, reasoning it couldn't be an exit for a kidnapper. With the dog's confirmation, officers force entry, discover JonBenét, and secure the area before contamination sets in. This rapid revelation would have shifted the entire investigation, prompting immediate questioning of those present and preventing the hours of unchecked movement by friends and family that later obliterated potential evidence. In Lawrence Schiller's book, Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, this exact debate is chronicled. Detective Larry Mason advocated for Yogi, a proven bloodhound from Aurora that had once backtracked a 9-mile trail to locate a missing child, emphasizing its superiority in vehicle abduction scenarios. Yet, Boulder Chief Tom Kobe preferred local German Shepherds, which were prone to distractions and less effective on air scents, leading to an impasse that squandered precious time. The failure to utilize tracking dogs wasn't just an oversight, it represented a fundamental misjudgment of the case's nature, treating it as a straightforward abduction rather than probing for internal inconsistencies. John Ramsey himself complained vociferously about police incompetence in interviews in his book, The Death of Innocence, lambasting the lack of FBI involvement and investigative thoroughness, but tellingly, he never mentioned dogs or questioned their absence. This omission is striking, given how canines have cracked similar cases in the Madeleine McCann disappearance. Dogs alerted to the family's apartment and car, reshaping theories. In Lassie Peterson's murder, scent dogs traced her path to the water's edge, implicating her husband. Even in Chris Watts' familicide, dogs helped confirm no external intruders by failing to pick up foreign trails. Had Boulder followed suit, a dog might have not only located JonBenét, but also scanned the perimeter for outgoing scents, debunking any intruder narrative on the spot. Detective Linda Arndt's 34-page report references this potential early on, noting Sergeant Ren Baranowski's suggestion to involve Aurora's bloodhounds if needed, yet the call never materialized amid the morning's confusion. Critics argue this delay allowed for staging elements, like the elaborate ransom note, to dominate the narrative unchecked. Extending this logic, tracking dogs might have unraveled the DNA myth early too, by isolating scents on clothing or the device, correlating with touch DNA later found. Modern retrospectives, like those in Oxygen's coverage, emphasize how John's recent pushes for advanced DNA tech overlooked these basics. But in 1996, dogs were the low-tech powerhouse. The Aurora Hound's track record, locating a child after a partial drive, aligned perfectly with a supposed vehicle abduction. Yet Eller's preference for local assets prevailed. This choice, detailed in Schiller's pages 16-17, underscores how solvable the puzzle was. Alert, JonBenét found. Note scrutinized as staging, parents questioned under oath by afternoon. In analogous cases like Peterson's, dogs sealed fates by negating alibis. Here, they could have done the same, preventing 28 years of speculation. The absence of footprints in the frost surrounding the home stood as one of the most damning pieces of evidence against any external intrusion, pointing instead to an internal orchestration from the very beginning. Officer Barry Weiss, upon arrival, observed the patio covered in undisturbed frost, a crystalline layer that would have captured any intruder's steps with unforgiving clarity. This frost, clinging to walkways and hard surfaces like brick and paving, remained pristine, with no impressions or disruptions noted in the initial reports. Detective Linda Arndt's detailed account emphasized the frost had not been disturbed, a fact that directly contradicted theories of someone slipping in from outside during the cold December night. How could an outsider navigate the perimeter, perhaps climbing through a basement window or grate, without leaving a single mark in this fragile coating? Solid materials conduct cold more efficiently than grass or vegetation, meaning frost on paths lingers longer and melts slower, yet by the tonographs were taken later, it had vanished, creating a misleading perception of bare ground. This natural phenomenon explained why early visuals showed no snow around doors and sidewalks. But the frost's integrity screamed of no external entry, forcing a revaluation towards staging within the household itself. Linking this void outside to peculiar footprints inside the home further solidified the notion of internal setup. In the basement wine cellar, where JonBenét was ultimately found, investigators discovered a partial imprint of a high-tech boot in the mold on the floor. A mark that initially fueled intruder speculations but later unraveled as potentially planted or unrelated. This print, bearing the brand's distinctive logo, didn't match any footwear owned by the immediate family at first glance, prompting questions about an outsider's presence. Yet, deeper scrutiny revealed inconsistencies. The print's location in a dusty, seldom used area suggested it could have been left deliberately to mislead, especially since no corresponding tracks led from entry points like the grate or windows. Why would an intruder wear such identifiable boots, leaving a solitary mark in the cellar, but none in the frost-laden paths outside? Reports from 2000 indicated police linked similar high-tech prints to items in the home, and by 2002, sources confirmed that footprints and palm prints in the basement were attributed to family members or visitors, not a mysterious assailant. This internal anomaly, strange marks confined to the house's depths, mirrored the overall staging, where elements like the ransom note and device appeared contrived from household materials, reinforcing that everything originated from within. Overall, the frost's untouched state extended beyond the patio to walkways and sidewalks, where conduction principles made these surfaces ideal traps for footprints. Brick and concrete cool faster than surrounding grass, preserving frost longer into the morning, yet Weiss's observation held no disturbances whatsoever. This scientific detail debunked later claims of melted snow obscuring tracks. Frost on hard paths would have endured, capturing even gloved or careful steps. Inside, the high-tech imprint contrasted sharply, appearing in concrete dust near JonBenét, a spot that screamed intentional placement rather than accidental passage. Arndt's report, spanning 34 pages, immortalized this frost observation, attributing it specifically to Weiss and underscoring its implications. No footprints meant no intruder. This tied seamlessly to the basement's peculiarities, where the high-tech mark, found in mold, lacked accompanying trails from supposed entry points. Forensic experts have since noted how such isolated prints often indicate staging, especially absent outdoor corroboration. Furthermore, the undisturbed leaf debris around the basement grate served as a silent testament to the absence of any external intruder, directly challenging theories of someone slipping into the home unnoticed. Desiccated leaves, crunchy and scattered in the early morning frost, blanketed the area beneath the three windows overlooking the grate, yet not a single fragment showed signs of being crushed or displaced. Boulder police photos from the official files captured this pristine state, a bed of leaves and dirt untouched, with no tracks leading to or from the supposed entry point. If an intruder had knelt or crawled through this space, hands and knees pressing the debris to maneuver under the grate and through the window, leaves would have inevitably adhered to clothing or shoes, transferring inside. Yet, examinations of the basement revealed not one stray leaf or fragment. Despite the need for the perpetrator to navigate on all fours, not but likely twice in that confined, debris-filled area. This lack of transfer, combined with the outdoor foliage's integrity, painted a clear picture no one had traversed from outside, forcing the conclusion that all events unfolded internally, without breach from the elements. Linking this to the windows themselves, the basement setup further debunked intrusion claims. The grate, positioned in a spot ringed by fences for supposed privacy, was actually overlooked by multiple windows above and a nearby door with its own pane, making it one of the least covered entry spots imaginable. Lou Smit's demonstration of climbing through, performed in broad daylight, without replicating nighttime frost or snow conditions, ignored how hips and hands would have swept away cobwebs and leaves, yet police images showed intact spiderwebs stretching across the window well and undisturbed dust on the sills. These cobwebs, delicate and unbroken, would have snapped under the slightest pressure from an intruder's passage. No such disruption appeared, and the foliage outside remained as it was, with no leaves scattered anew or tracked indoors. This evidence aligned with the frost observations. Hard surfaces around doors and sidewalks showed no footprints, while vegetative areas like the grate's surround held their debris in place, proving no entry or exit occurred via these routes. Compounding this, a suitcase positioned directly beneath one basement window was cited by some as a booster for an escaping intruder, ostensibly placed to aid in climbing out after the act. However, the contents of this valise, a blanket and a notebook belonging to John Andrew Ramsey, John's son from a previous marriage, raised immediate red flags. John Andrew was not present at the home during the incident, staying elsewhere, and his personal items had no logical reason to be stored in the basement wine cellar. Why would an intruder, after committing such a crime, pause to arrange a suitcase containing family belongings as a makeshift step? The placement felt contrived, more like an internal staging element than a spontaneous tool for flight. Fingerprints or marks on the suitcase might have clarified this, but early scene contamination obscured such details, leaving the valleys as another indicator of manipulation from within rather than an outsider's improvisation. Further eroding the intruder narrative, one basement window bore a break that John himself attributed to an earlier incident where he smashed it to gain entry after forgetting his keys. This explanation, offered during initial questioning, strained credibility given the family's affluent status and access to spare keys or locksmiths. Why resort to breaking a window in one's own home, especially in a remote basement area? The glass shards and frame showed signs of the break predating the night in question, with dust and cobwebs accumulating around the damage, suggesting it wasn't a fresh point of access. If an intruder had exploited this vulnerability, debris from the entry, glass fragments or displaced sill dust, would have scattered, yet inspections revealed none, aligning with the undisturbed leaves nearby. This pre-existing flaw, unaddressed and unexplained convincingly, hinted at a household oversight rather than an exploited weakness, reinforcing that no forced entry occurred and all anomalies stemmed from internal decisions. The family's failure to activate the home's alarm system that night added another layer to the evidence against external paths. Installed for security in a neighborhood plagued by recent burglaries, the system remained off, with no reports of tampering or override by an intruder. John and Patsy confirmed it wasn't set, citing habitual lapses, but this convenience for a supposed kidnapper, who navigated a sprawling unfamiliar home in darkness without triggering any alerts, defied logic. If someone had entered via the grate or broken window, motion sensors or door contacts should have activated, yet silence prevailed. This inaction, paired with the leaf debris's stillness, suggested the system was deliberately left dormant, accommodating internal movements rather than risking exposure to outsiders. No signs of forced deactivation appeared, like cut wires or bypassed panels, further indicating the home's defenses were neutralized from within, not breached. Tying back to the windows, the lack of footprints or debris transfer extended to other potential access points, such as side doors or upper-level panes left ajar for Christmas lights. Police noted undisturbed frost on these paths too, with no scuffs or marks on sills that would indicate climbing or forcing. The grate area's foliage, full of pecan foam and dirt, would have clung to any intruder's gloves or boots, yet basement floors showed no such residue. Smit's claims of finger marks on panes, possibly gloved, and a wall scuff ignored this if gloved. Why no leaf fragments carried in? The suitcase below, with its familial contents, seemed positioned post facto, perhaps to suggest an exit that never happened, as no corresponding outdoor tracks in frost or leaves supported it. John Andrews' items inside underscored this. His absence meant someone else placed them there, likely to fabricate a scene, not as an intruder's random prop. As mentioned in the previous section, much of the evidence related to the intruder investigation direction is influenced by Detective Lou Smit. However, Lou Smit's hypothesis has some problems. Let's talk a bit about Lou Smit and his hypothesis to analyze what the problems in his hypothesis are, whether all of them are wrong or not, and why, despite many shortcomings, this hypothesis still receives the trust of many people. Born Andrew Louis Smit in 1935 in Denver, Colorado, Lou Smit grew up in a modest family and developed an early interest in law enforcement that would define his life. After serving in the U.S. during the Korean War era, he returned home and began his career in policing in the early 1960s. Starting as a patrol officer with the Colorado Springs Police Department, his sharp instincts and relentless work ethic quickly propelled him through the ranks, and by the 1970s, he had become a detective renowned for his meticulous approach to cases. Over the decades, Smit worked across various agencies, including the El Paso County Sheriff's Department and later the District Attorney's Office in Colorado Springs, where he honed his skills in interrogation, evidence analysis, and crime scene reconstruction. Known for his deep Christian faith, which he often credited for guiding his moral compass in investigations, Smit balanced a demanding career with family life, raising several children and maintaining a reputation as a devoted husband and father. Smit's investigative prowess became legendary in Colorado law enforcement circles, where he boasted a solve rate exceeding 90% across more than 200 cases of murder. He never lost a case in court, a testament to his thorough preparation and ability to build airtight prosecutions. Colleagues often described him as a detective's detective, someone who combined old-school gumshoe work with emerging forensic techniques. In high-profile investigations, such as the 1982 murder of Heather Dawn Church, Smit's innovative use of fingerprint databases led to the capture of a suspect years later, showcasing his patience and forward-thinking mindset. Even after retiring in the early 1990s, Smit couldn't stay away from the field. He frequently consulted on cold cases and mentored younger officers, emphasizing the importance of empathy for victims' families and a commitment to justice over expediency. His faith played a central role as he prayed over cases and sought divine guidance, which he believed helped him see clues others missed. This blend of spirituality and professionalism earned him respect across departments, and by the mid-1990s, Smit was seen as a go-to expert for complex, stalled investigations. In early 1997, just months into retirement, Smit was pulled back into active duty when the Boulder County District Attorney's Office recruited him to assist with a high-profile child cases that had gripped the nation. At 62 years old, he brought decades of experience to the table, diving into the evidence with fresh eyes. Smit spent 18 months on the case, reviewing crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and witness statements, while conducting his own experiments to test entry and exit scenarios. He created detailed diagrams and videos to illustrate his findings, often working late into the night from his home office. His methodical process involved compiling a massive spreadsheet of over 600 potential suspects, complete with alibis, motives, and connections, which became a cornerstone of his work. Smit's involvement deepened his conviction in certain leads, and he collaborated closely with forensic experts to analyze physical traces like marks on walls and unidentified footprints. By mid-1998, however, tensions arose with the Boulder Police Department over differing interpretations of the evidence, leading Smit to resign in protest, citing concerns that the investigation was narrowing too prematurely. Even after stepping away officially, he continued his efforts independently, driven by a personal vow to uncover the truth. For more details about his conflict with the Boulder Police Department, it emerged almost immediately after he joined the investigation in early 1997. Brought in by District Attorney Alex Hunter to provide an experienced outsider's perspective, Smit quickly clashed with detectives who were firmly convinced that the family was involved, viewing his focus on external leads as a distraction from what they saw as overwhelming internal indicators. This tension boiled over in meetings where Smit presented his analyses of physical traces, like marks on walls and unidentified footprints, arguing they pointed away from the household, only to face pushback from police who dismissed these as irrelevant or misinterpreted. By mid-1998, the discord had escalated. Smit felt the department was tunnel-visioned, ignoring his compiled list of over 600 alternative suspects and refusing to chase leads that didn't align with their narrative. In a pointed resignation letter dated September 20, 1998, to Hunter, Smit accused the police of incompetence and bias, stating that the investigation had overlooked crucial intruder evidence and was prematurely narrowing its scope, which he believed compromised justice. He wrote that he could no longer participate in what he saw as a flawed process, emphasizing his moral obligation to follow the facts wherever they led, even if it meant standing alone. The fallout from Smit's departure intensified the already strained relationship between the DA's office and the police, drawing intervention from Colorado Governor Roy Romer, who appointed Special Prosecutor Michael Cain to oversee a grand jury amid the infighting. Smit, undeterred, continued his work independently, collaborating with forensic experts and creating demonstrative videos to support his views, which he later shared with the grand jury in 1999. Police officials, including those like Steve Thomas, who resigned shortly before Smit, citing DA interference, publicly criticized Smit's approach as overly sympathetic and flawed, accusing him of being swayed by personal beliefs rather than hard evidence. Throughout his career, Smit's dedication to underdogs and overlooked details set him apart, making him a beacon for justice in Colorado's criminal justice system. He authored reports and gave lectures on forensic advancements, stressing the importance of physical evidence over assumptions. In one notable case, his reconstruction of a crime scene using video demos helped secure a conviction for a serial killer, a technique he refined over years. Smit's work with district attorneys fostered interagency cooperation, breaking down silos that often hampered investigations. His personal touch, visiting crime scenes at odd hours to feel the environment, yielded breakthroughs that data alone couldn't, and he shared these intuitions in training programs. By the time of his passing, Smit had mentored hundreds, leaving a network of investigators who carried forward his principles. Books and documentaries, like Lou and JonBenét, by John Wesley Anderson, chronicled his life, highlighting how his unyielding pursuit influenced not just outcomes but the very culture of detective work in the state. Lou Smit's intruder hypothesis, while compelling in its presentation, suffered from several interpretive flaws that undermined its overall credibility, particularly in how he handled physical traces at the scene. Smit often emphasized marks on walls and panes as evidence of forced entry, interpreting them as glove impressions or scuffs from an outsider's movements, but this analysis selectively ignored contextual inconsistencies that could suggest alternative explanations. For instance, in his video demonstrations, Smit recreated scenarios where he maneuvered through tight spaces, claiming these marks aligned with an intruder's path, yet he conducted these in controlled, daytime conditions without accounting for environmental variables that might alter visibility or residue transfer. This approach risked oversimplifying complex dynamics, as Smit's focus on isolated impressions didn't adequately address why similar traces weren't found in logical sequences, like leading from an entry point to the interior. Critics within the investigation noted that Smit's enthusiasm for these details sometimes bordered on confirmation bias, where he amplified supportive elements while downplaying contradictions, leading to a narrative that felt more reconstructed than evidentiary. One anecdote from his time on the case illustrates this. During a briefing with the DA's team, Smit passionately argued that a wall scuff indicated a boot kick during escape, drawing from his experience in other burglaries. But colleagues pointed out that the mark's height and angle didn't match typical human mechanics in the confined space, suggesting it could be incidental wear rather than deliberate action. Another issue lay in Smit's exploitation of unidentified genetic material, which he positioned as the linchpin of his theory, asserting it belonged to a single unknown male perpetrator. However, his analysis glossed over the composite nature of the samples, treating them as definitive proof of an outsider without fully exploring contamination possibilities from manufacturing or innocent transfers. Smit's public statements, including interviews where he declared the material, the killer's DNA, amplified this oversight, potentially misleading stakeholders by not emphasizing how trace amounts could deposit non-suspiciously. In one story recounted by former colleagues, Smit once prayed over evidence bags containing clothing items, seeking insight, and emerged convinced the profiles exonerated insiders. But this spiritual intuition sometimes overshadowed scientific nuance, like reports indicating multiple contributors that complicated single suspect matching. This selective emphasis contributed to a hypothesis that, while innovative in advocating for advanced testing, failed to reconcile why decades of database searches yielded no hits if the source was indeed criminal. Smit's handling of potential entry points, such as grates and windows, revealed problems in scalability and realism. He theorized an intruder could navigate these without leaving broad disruptions, basing this on personal reenactments where he demonstrated feasibility. But these simulations didn't replicate full conditions, like carrying additional weight or managing resistance, which would amplify disturbances. Anecdotes from his independent work post-resignation highlight this. Smit invited media to film him crawling through similar setups, claiming it proved silent entry, yet participants noted how his movements inevitably shifted nearby materials, a detail he minimized in reports. This minimization weakened his claims, as it didn't address why no corresponding shifts appeared in official photos, suggesting his exploitation prioritized possibility over probability. In interpreting household items as tools for an outsider, Smit's hypothesis encountered logical gaps. He pointed to positioned objects, like luggage, as aids for exit, inferring premeditated use. But this overlooked how such placements aligned more with familiar access than random discovery. Stories from his spreadsheet compilations show Smit cross-referencing suspect profiles with item ownership, yet he sometimes dismissed mismatch. Lee didn't fit his framework, leading to a theory that strained against ownership patterns. This selective filtering, while efficient for narrowing lists, risked excluding viable alternatives, as seen when he advocated for certain leads in grand jury testimony emphasizing alignments, but not potential fabrications. Smit's approach to auditory evidence, like reported screams, also presented issues in contextualization. He argued these could originate from isolated areas without alerting occupants, drawing from architectural analyses of sound travel. But this interpretation didn't fully integrate neighbor accounts with internal acoustics, potentially underestimating propagation in the structure. In one recounted meeting, Smit used diagrams to show muffled zones, convincing some, yet detractors noted his models didn't factor in variables like open vents or furniture, which could amplify noises unexpectedly. Broader methodological problems arose in Smit's suspect database, where he amassed hundreds of entries based on loose connections, like proximity or prior offenses, but his exploitation often lacked rigorous vetting for alibis or motives. Anecdotes from his family reveal he worked tirelessly on this, cross-checking with national databases, yet the sheer volume sometimes diluted focus, with entries including improbable figures that stretched plausibility. This expansive net, while thorough, introduced noise that complicated rather than clarified, as Smit's hypothesis leaned on quantity over quality in suspect profiling. Smit's faith-infused perspective, while a personal strength, occasionally colored his evidence handling, leading to interpretations that prioritized redemption narratives over accusatory ones. He once shared in an interview how prayer guided him to see good in people, which influenced his reluctance to pursue certain angles, but this could bias against exploring internal inconsistencies. Stories from his career, like solving a cold case through divine hunches, underscore this, yet in application here, it sometimes led to overemphasizing exculpatory traces while sidelining incriminating patterns. In dealing with written artifacts, Smit's analysis treated stylistic elements as outsider hallmarks, comparing them to media influences, but this overlooked linguistic forensics suggesting familiarity. His comparisons to films like Dirty Harry aimed to show copied phrasing, yet he didn't deeply probe why such elements mirrored known communications, potentially missing authorship clues. During grand jury preparations, Smit testified on these parallels, but accounts suggest he downplayed expert opinions on handwriting, focusing instead on content to support his view. Smit's resignation itself stemmed from these interpretive clashes, where his evidence handling diverged sharply from departmental consensus. In letters and statements, he accused others of bias, but his own selective emphasis on certain traces mirrored this, creating a feedback loop of contention. Anecdotes from post-resignation interviews show Smit defending his methods as holistic, yet critics saw them as fragmented, prioritizing isolated moments over cohesive timelines. Ultimately, Smit's hypothesis gained traction through his charismatic delivery and track record, but problems in evidence exploitation, selective focus, unrealistic recreations, and overlooked nuances persisted. Despite flaws, his work resonated because it offered hope and alternative narratives in a polarized probe, drawing support from those seeking closure beyond initial suspicions. His spreadsheet, for instance, provided a tangible tool that many found reassuring, even if entries lacked depth. This enduring appeal lay in Smit's reputation as a truth seeker, making his interpretations trustworthy to adherents despite analytical gaps. In media specials, Smit's passionate defenses humanized his stance, turning evidential shortcomings into perceived oversights by others, sustaining belief in his framework among true crime enthusiasts and family advocates alike. On the surface, this case should have been solved quickly with the right steps and thorough checks. Instead, it spun into endless controversy, confusing even seasoned investigators like Lou Smit. But the deepest divide didn't come from the crime itself, it came from the evidence. Many believe John Ramsey played a direct role in shaping that evidence, scattering false trails to keep suspicion away from his own family. John's unparalleled access to every corner of the home positioned him uniquely to interact with all potential evidence, and even with JonBenét herself, raising questions about the authenticity of the scene as it was discovered. As the head of the household, he had free rein over the sprawling residence, including remote areas like the basement where key items were later found, allowing him to handle objects without immediate scrutiny. This access extended to personal belongings of family members, such as tools or notebooks that surfaced in unexpected places, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge could relocate them strategically. In interviews years later, John recounted his movements that morning, describing how he methodically checked rooms before descending to the lower level, a narrative that, while presented as a father's desperate search, highlighted his familiarity with hidden spaces others overlooked. This capability wasn't just theoretical. When he opened the latch door and encountered JonBenét, His immediate actions, lifting her and carrying her upstairs, directly altered the configuration, blending his traces with whatever was already there. Stories from the initial police response, as detailed in reports, show how John's presence dominated the scene, with officers deferring to him in ways that allowed unchecked contact, underscoring his central role in how evidence was first encountered and potentially modified. The evidence scattered throughout the home exhibited a curious fragmentation, each piece subtly directing suspicion toward different family members without converging on a single narrative, which in itself hinted at deliberate misdirection. For instance, the Swiss Army knife found in the basement near where JonBenét was located drew eyes toward Burke, as it was identified as his from a previous gift, a tool he reportedly carried for whittling or small tasks. This placement seemed too coincidental, as if positioned to imply a child's involvement in some mishap, yet no direct link tied it to any specific action, leaving it as a dangling clue that split investigative focus. Anecdotes from family friends, shared in later documentaries, recalled Burkett's interest in such gadgets, but the knife's appearance in that isolated spot, far from his room, suggested relocation by someone aiming to sow doubt. Similarly, the Maglite flashlight on the kitchen counter, a heavy household item, carried implications for Burke due to its size and accessibility to a 9-year-old, potentially usable in a moment of sibling conflict. Police notes from the time described its unusual location, out of place from typical storage, fueling theories of impromptu use, but again, without fingerprints or other ties, it fragmented blame than pinpointing it. John's own accounts in his book described the flashlight as a family item, yet his narrative avoided explaining its relocation, subtly shifting attention to the children's dynamics while keeping himself peripheral. Shifting to the ransom note, its elaborate composition and placement on the staircase pointed fingers at Patsy, with handwriting analyses initially suggesting similarities to her style, including loops and flourishes that experts debated in court documents. The note's length and dramatic language, demanding a sum matching John's bonus, appeared crafted with insider knowledge, yet the paper and pen sourced from the home implied someone comfortable lingering to compose it. Stories from Patsy's circle, as recounted in media interviews, highlighted her organizational habits with notepads, making the note's origin seem tied to her routines, but subsequent expert rulings deemed the match inconclusive, leaving it as another divisive element. This redirection toward Patsy, through a document that screamed staging, diluted overall suspicion by creating multiple threads, each pulling in a different direction without resolution. John's role in discovering and handling the note early on, as he described in televised appearances, positioned him to influence its interpretation, yet he remained untouched by its implications, further illustrating the evidence's engineered scatter. The suitcase beneath the basement window, containing a blanket and notebook belonging to John Andrew, introduced yet another layer of diversion, subtly implicating John's son from a prior marriage who was absent that night. Positioned as if to aid an escape, the valiz's contents, personal items with no reason to be in that remote storage, suggested an attempt to link the scene to someone outside the immediate family circle. Anecdotes from John Andrew himself, in later statements, confirmed the items were his, but he expressed bafflement at their location, as he had no involvement in the household that evening, implying relocation by another hand. This setup fragmented suspicion further, casting a shadow on an alibi-verified individual while avoiding direct ties to those present, creating a web of possibilities that muddled the probe. John's familiarity with his son's belongings, as the connecting family link, placed him in a position to orchestrate such a placement, using it to evoke an external narrative without committing to specifics. Strikingly, none of these elements directly incriminated John himself, a pattern that hinted at careful curation to deflect scrutiny from the one person with overarching access. The DNA traces, potentially the most objective clue, were compromised by actions John framed as paternal instincts, lifting JonBenét, removing tape, and relocating her, which inevitably introduced contaminants like fibers or skin cells from his own contact. In his accounts during polygraph sessions and media spots, John described these moves as reflexive responses to shock, yet forensic experts noted how such handling erased latent prints and muddied genetic profiles, turning what could have been clear markers into ambiguous mixtures. This fatherly reaction, narrative, repeated in his book and interviews, shielded him from deeper questioning, as it humanized behaviors that objectively altered evidence. Stories from the scene, as relayed by Detective Arndt, depicted John taken without restraint, his composure allowing precise interventions that scattered traces across family lines without looping back to him. This dispersion of clues, knife and flashlight toward Burke, note toward Patsy, suitcase toward John Andrew, created a deliberate mosaic of misdirection, where each piece isolated suspicion without overlap, suggesting a mastermind intent on fragmentation. John's central vantage, as the one who discovered Key arrangements positioned him to embed these red herrings, using household familiarity to craft diversions. In grand jury testimonies leaked years later, discussions circled these items, odd placements, with experts pondering why they implicated others so neatly while sparing the patriarch. John's interviews, like those with Barbara Walters, wove tales of family unity amid chaos, subtly reinforcing the evidence's scatter as random rather than engineered, yet the pattern betrayed intent. The knife's appearance, far from Burke's domain, echoed tales of misplaced tools in family lore, but its basement locale suggested purposeful relocation to evoke childish involvement without proof. Similarly, the flashlight's counterposition, as John casually mentioned in statements, avoided tying it to his own use, despite its utility for an adult navigating dark spaces. Patsy's note parallels, debated in forensic circles, were amplified by John's early pointing out of the bonus amount, a detail that looped back to insider knowledge but deflected from his own financial insights. John Andrews' items in the valise, as he puzzled over in media responses, lacked context for their presence, implying a hand familiar with his possessions, John's, to stage an escape prop that hinted at absentee involvement. This curation ensured no arrow pointed squarely at John, with DNA's taint serving as the final veil, his instinctive actions erasing clarity. Overall, the evidence's engineered divergence, walling off John from blame, underscored his pivotal orchestration, using access to weave a tapestry of divided doubts that protected his centrality. John Ramsey's strategic engagement with media outlets played a pivotal role in shaping public perception, often portraying him as a grieving father relentlessly seeking justice rather than a figure under scrutiny. From the early days following the incident, John granted selective interviews to high-profile networks like CNN and ABC, where he emphasized themes of police incompetence and the plausibility of an external perpetrator. In a notable 1997 appearance on CNN with Larry King, John detailed his frustrations with the Boulder authorities, recounting how their initial handling allowed for contamination and delayed critical leads, all while steering the conversation toward overlooked suspects in the community. This narrative not only humanized him, but also sowed doubt about official conclusions, encouraging viewers to question the focus on his family. Years later, in a 2016 interview with Barbara Walters on 20/20, John revisited these points, sharing anecdotes about anonymous tips he received post-incident, including one from a supposed insider claiming knowledge of a pedophile ring linked to Pagents. He described sifting through these leads personally, painting himself as an active participant in the pursuit of truth, which resonated with audiences sympathetic to parental loss. This pattern of media appearances, spaced over decades, allowed John to control the timing and tone, often coinciding with anniversaries or new developments to keep his version foregrounded. For instance, in a 2024 Netflix documentary episode, John recounted a story from 2000 where he met with a private investigator who uncovered a list of local offenders, using this to argue for broader DNA testing, thereby redirecting public discourse towards systemic failures rather than familial dynamics. Beyond television, John's use of print and online platforms amplified his influence, crafting a counter-narrative that challenged prevailing suspicions. In collaboration with Patsy, he co-authored The Death of Innocence in 2000, a book that chronicled their experiences in exhaustive detail, from the morning discovery to ongoing harassment by tabloids. Within its pages, John shared personal vignettes, like the time he received a threatening letter mimicking the ransom note style, which he presented as evidence of ongoing external malice. This story, woven into chapters decrying media sensationalism, positioned the family as victims of a witch hunt, with John emerging as the steadfast portrayal advocating for reform in child protection laws. The book's promotion involved a tour where John fielded questions at signings, often recounting how a reporter once ambushed him at home, leading to a heated exchange that he framed as emblematic of invasive journalism. By 2019, John contributed to an updated edition, incorporating fresh anecdotes about collaborating with genetic genealogists on cold cases, subtly aligning himself with cutting-edge forensics to bolster credibility. Online, through websites and social media managed by his team, John posted updates, such as a 2023 blog entry detailing a meeting with Boulder officials where he pushed for retesting items, sharing a story of a lab technician who confided in him about overlooked samples. This digital presence allowed real-time shaping of opinion, countering viral theories on forums by highlighting his proactive stance, thus fostering a loyal following that echoed his calls for external accountability. Legal actions against media entities formed another cornerstone of John's efforts to steer public sentiment, using the courtroom as a stage to affirm his innocence and discredit detractors. In 1999, he and his family filed a defamation suit against Star magazine for articles implying Patsy's involvement, leading to a settlement that included a public retraction, which John leveraged in subsequent interviews to illustrate media overreach. He recounted in a 2001 radio appearance how the lawsuit stemmed from a fabricated story about family secrets, turning the victory into a cautionary tale that garnered sympathy from listeners wary of tabloid excess. Similarly, the 2001 case against former Detective Steve Thomas, whose book accused the family of cover-up, resulted in an out-of-court resolution, with undisclosed terms, but John publicly described a vindication, sharing details of depositions where he confronted Thomas's claims point by point. This narrative of triumph over adversity resonated, as John framed these battles as necessary to protect his surviving children's reputations. In a more recent escalation, the 2016 lawsuit against CBS following their miniseries, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, which speculated on Burke's role, sought $750 million and ended in a 2019 settlement. John detailed in a podcast episode how the series distorted facts, recounting a family meeting where they decided to sue to set the record straight, positioning the action as a defense of truth rather than suppression. These suits, often settled confidentially, allowed John to claim moral high ground without full trials, influencing public views by associating criticism with legal peril. John's alliances with sympathetic investigators and experts further molded opinion, lending authoritative weight to his perspective. His close collaboration with Lou Smit, who resigned from the official probe in 1998 citing biases, produced materials like videos demonstrating potential entry points, which John promoted in media rounds. In a 2000 interview, John shared a story of visiting Smit's home office, where they pored over photos together, emerging with renewed conviction and alternative leads, a tale that humanized their partnership and elevated Smit's findings in public eyes. Similarly, hiring former FBI profiler John Douglas in 1997 yielded a report exonerating the family, which John referenced repeatedly, as in a 2006 op-ed where he described Douglas' analysis as a turning point that shifted his despair to determination. These endorsements, amplified through John's platforms, countered official skepticism, drawing supporters who viewed him as a crusader against institutional flaws. Philanthropic endeavors tied to the cause also subtly directed sentiment, with John establishing foundations focused on child safety, using them to host events where he shared personal reflections. At a 2003 gala, he recounted launching the initiative after a conversation with a fellow parent who lost a child, framing it as a legacy for JonBenét that channeled grief into action. This positioning garnered positive coverage, associating John with advocacy rather than controversy, and influencing donors and attendees to adopt his viewpoint. John's narrative evolution over time, adapting to new technologies and audiences, ensured sustained influence. In the social media era, he engaged through verified accounts, posting threads in 2022 about DNA advancements, including a story of consulting with a genealogist who traced unrelated cases successfully, urging followers to petition for similar efforts. This interactive approach built communities that amplified his message, countering online skeptics with curated facts. Specifically, a clearer and more specific media navigation plan appears to have taken shape in recent years, with a sharpened focus on the intruder hypothesis and DNA evidence as central pillars. John Ramsey's appearances have become more targeted, emphasizing advanced genetic testing and overlooked leads that point away from familial involvement, crafting a narrative of ongoing pursuit for external culprits. The most recent evidence of this refined plan manifests in John's continuous presence on Fox News throughout 2025, where he has repeatedly discussed the intruder theory and DNA advancements. John elaborated on how untested items from the scene could yield matches through modern labs, sharing a story of consulting with experts who identified potential profiles overlooked in the 1990s. He recounted a recent collaboration with genealogists, describing how they traced unrelated cases successfully, urging similar applications here to identify a stranger perpetrator. This interview, part of a promotional push, woven in anecdotes about anonymous tips received over the years, including one from a former investigator claiming neighborhood connections to suspicious figures. Just days later, on September 7, another Fox News segment featured John appealing directly to political figures for support, detailing a letter he sent outlining DNA retesting needs, framing it as a bipartisan issue for justice. These spots, dense with technical details and personal resolve, have amplified the intruder angle, with John citing Smit's old analyses as foundational while updating them with 2025 tech, effectively rebranding the narrative for contemporary viewers. Complementing these broadcasts, John's participation at CrimeCon Denver 25 in early September marked a live extension of this media orchestration, drawing thousands to sessions where he delved into the intruder hypothesis and DNA's untapped potential. At the event held at the Gaylord Rockies Resort, John headlined a panel titled, "The Murder of JonBenét Ramsey. Where are we now, and why are answers taking so long?" recounting his decades-long push for independent reviews. He shared a poignant story from a 2024 lab visit where technicians demonstrated how minute samples could generate profiles, inspiring his renewed optimism for breakthroughs. During a meet and greet, attendees reported John discussing specific evidence like unidentified traces on clothing, arguing they align with an outsider's profile rather than household contamination. This interactive format allowed him to field questions directly, such as one about recent genealogy successes in other cases, where he drew parallels to encourage public pressure on authorities. CrimeCon's true crime enthusiasts, many capturing clips for social media, amplified his message, turning the event into a viral echo chamber for the intruder focus. At the heart of this surge in visibility lies what seems to be a primary objective: promoting Fox Nation's upcoming documentary series on the case, slated for a 2025 release with John's enthusiastic backing. In his Fox News spots, John has teased unprecedented access granted to the production team, including family archives and expert consultations on DNA. He recounted granting interviews to the filmmakers, sharing untold stories like a 2000 tip that led to a dead-end suspect, but reinforced his belief in external involvement. This promotional synergy, with John appearing on the network's flagship shows to hype the project, mirrors coordinated campaigns and entertainment, aiming to build anticipation among subscribers. The series promises deep dives into genetic evidence, with John providing narration snippets that underscore the intruder theory, positioning it as a fresh lens on unresolved questions. This latest effort could mirror the controversial 2024 documentary that sparked debates over its perceived bias toward the Ramsey family perspective. In that production, John's involvement included on-camera reflections that emphasized investigative missteps and DNA's exonerating potential, leading critics to argue it glossed over counterarguments. The case stands as a stark example of how seemingly minor signs, if detected and pursued early, can profoundly alter the trajectory of an investigation, potentially leading to swift resolutions instead of protracted mysteries. Small anomalies, like undisturbed environmental traces or misplaced household items, often hold the key to unraveling complex narratives. Yet their oversight can cascade into missed opportunities, allowing assumptions to harden into flawed directions. In this instance, initial observations of pristine outdoor conditions, such as frost-covered paths without impressions, could have immediately challenged extra-entry theories, prompting a deeper focus on internal dynamics. Had these subtle cues been prioritized, resources might have shifted toward comprehensive forensic protocols, like deploying specialized tools for scent detection, which have proven effective in similar scenarios by confirming whether paths led inward or outward. Stories from seasoned investigators highlight how ignoring such details in other cases led to years of dead ends. Much like here, where early dismissal of inconsistencies permitted divergent paths to proliferate, diluting the probe's effectiveness. This underscores a broader lesson. Vigilance toward the minutiae isn't just procedural. It's essential to preventing the entrenchment of biases that skew evidence interpretation. The neglect of these peculiar signs not only sidelined viable investigative methods, but also allowed alternative approaches to wither unexplored, perpetuating a cycle of uncertainty. For example, debates over canine assistance, which could have mapped movements within minutes, were mired in indecision, reflecting how overlooked oddities, like the absence of debris transfer, failed to trigger urgent revaluations. This inaction meant that advanced techniques, such as detailed acoustic mapping to trace sounds reported by neighbors, were delayed or dismissed, despite their potential to correlate auditory clues with spatial layouts. Anecdotes from law enforcement training sessions often cite similar oversights, where small irregularities in scenes were later revealed as pivotal, but only after exhaustive reviews years down the line. Here, the failure to connect these dots early on meant that holistic strategies, integrating physical traces with behavioral analyses, were bypassed, leading to fragmented efforts that chased shadows rather than substance. The lesson is clear: investigations thrive on interconnecting these minor elements. Their isolation invites inefficiency, as methods like systematic suspect cataloging lose momentum without foundational anchors from those initial signs. Compounding this was the carelessness exhibited by both the family and the on-site responders, which propelled the situation beyond manageable bounds, transforming a containable inquiry into an enduring enigma. Family members' unrestricted movements, such as inviting acquaintances into the space and handling items without restraint, introduced contaminants that muddled traces, erasing potential clarity from surfaces and objects. John's account of his search, for instance, detailed how he navigated rooms freely, a freedom that, while understandable in distress, inadvertently altered arrangements before documentation. Responders, in turn, permitted this latitude, failing to establish strict perimeters or log interactions, as recounted in official reports where officers later lamented the influx of theaters cleaning and shifting things. This mutual laxity, echoed in tales from other mishandled inquiries where similar oversights led to evidentiary voids, amplified the chaos, pushing the probe into realms of speculation. The family's selective cooperation, delaying formal statements, intertwined with authorities' procedural lapses, like incomplete initial sweeps, created a vortex where control slipped away, allowing media narratives to fill the gaps. Ultimately, this teaches that accountability at every level, from civilians to professionals, is crucial. Lapses in diligence don't just delay justice, they can obscure it indefinitely, turning solvable puzzles into perpetual debates.